מה קורה אביב?
מה המצב?
וואי, שמחה יש לנו היום אורח מחול.
יש לנו פרק מאוד מיוחד, זה הנושא מאוד יוצא דופן, ובמקרה האורח גם מחול, אנחנו נדבר אנגלית, אבל אני מבטיח שיהיה מאוד מעניין, כי אנחנו נדבר על שמות, אוקיי? אבל תכף תבינו בדיוק על מה מדובר. לפני שנגיד שלום לאנתוני, האורח שלנו, נגיד תודה לנותנת החסות שלנו, אינטל איגנייט, שהיא תוכנית האצה ייחודית ופורצת דרך עבור סטארט-אפים שנמצאים בשלבים מוקדמים יחסית לייף סייקל של חברה, שהמטרה העיקרית שלה היא לעזור ליזמים מובילים להאיץ את הסטארט-אפ שלהם באמצעות תוכנית אישית שנתפרת עבור הצרכים הייחודיים שלהם. לאורך התוכנית מתקיימות באופן שבועי סדנאות והכשרות בתחומים מגוונים במרכז העשייה הטכנולוגית והיזמית, פיתוח מוצר, למשל אסטרטגיה עסקית, שיווק, גיוס לקוחות ועוד. כל סטארט-אפ שמתקבל לתוכנית מקבל 2 מנטורים צמודים, אחד הוא יזם סדרתי מהתעשייה, והשני הוא איש טכנולוגי בכיר מאינטל. אינטל לא מבקשת מניות ולא שום תשלום אחר כדי להיות בחלק מהתוכנית, אז אם אתם סטארט-אפ שגייס לאחרונה לפחות $1,000,000 ועוסק בטכנולוגיות עמוקות בתחומים כמו בינה מלאכותית, מערכות אוטונומיות, מערכות מחשוב או סייבר, כנסו לאתר ותגישו מועמדות www.intel.com/ignite, www.intel.com/ignite, והנה אנחנו מתחילים את הפרק שלנו היום. Hello, is it good morning, Anthony?
It is good morning, thank you.
So good
You're
morning.
based in the Bay Area, right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm in Oakland, California.
Okay, not so far from San Francisco. So Anthony Shore, would you like to give us like a short introduction about yourself before we start?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. Hi, I'm Anthony Shore, and I name things. And I've been naming things for about 30 years now. I'm a linguist by training, but I have a deep background in broad marketing communications as a software product manager, software marketer. I used to do desktop. I used to do production and what historians call paste up. I also have experience as a typesetter and other broad marketing communications functions, but really have deep expertise in brand name development.
What do you mean by a namer? You come up with names for products and companies?
That's exactly right. I develop names for products and companies. Much of my work is for funded startups who have invented the next new thing. And I create typically a corporate name for them. Sometimes they need product names. I also work with some large established companies you know about. Many of them are in technology or in medical devices. Some of my work is also developing novel generic descriptors. So let's pretend you invent something. What is the category that it creates? And so I often develop these new category names for companies in addition to proprietary brand name.
How does one become a namer?
Yeah.
Well, I was, to some extent, I was born into this. My favorite book as a child was the American Heritage Dictionary, specifically an appendix of Proto-Indo-European roots. Basically, this seems esoteric, and it is to some extent, but it's a list of roots that were spoken in a language which we have no direct evidence of, a language that preceded German, Latin, Greek, and so on. And I love studying the roots because each root would give rise eventually over thousands of years to many words in different languages. So a root that meant one thing in Proto-Indo-European could mean something a little different in Latin, something a little different in Old German, and so on. And the generative quality of language that I discovered in that appendix of Proto-Indo-European roots just, it sent me. I was so enamored by language, and so I was really obsessed with the individual word growing up and continue to be obsessed with that to this day. And after having an academic career in linguistics and then moved on to marketing communications, in 1996, I came upon a job at a large branding agency called Landor Associates for a naming manager. And I joined that position in San Francisco in 1996, doing naming full time, and continue to do that to this very day. I left Landor in 2008 and started my own firm in 2009 called Operative Words at operativewords.com. And I've continued doing naming there. And really my focus is on names, as I've mentioned, but also taglines and other short forms of expression. Anything that's 6 words or fewer is something I may be capable at. And so
Anthony,
that's a little bit of my history naming things and how I got into this crazy career.
I'm sorry, what's the big deal? Why do I need you to come up with a name? Why I can't just name my company whatever and be done with it? Like, why do I
Yeah,
need
that's
to
a
hire
really great
a namer?
question. That's a great question. You know, we all have a facility for language, right? We're all fluent in our own languages. And many of us have experience naming things. We name children or pets, or I don't know, if you have a boat, you name your boat, right? But it's very different when you're compelled to develop a trademark, because to develop a trademark requires having a name that is unique and is not confusingly similar to other names in your category. Additionally, a trade name, a trademark, has a purpose. It has a function. It needs to help sell products. It needs to build awareness. It needs to accrue equity. And it may have other requirements that a name of your child or a name of a pet does not have. And anyone who's attempted to develop a proprietary name, a unique trademark, has come into the reality that all of the low-hanging fruit, all of the obvious names are already taken. I would never say all the good names are already taken, because they're not. But I would absolutely say that all of the obvious names are taken. And so it turns out it really requires a very special set of skills to develop and ultimately secure a trademark. And having someone on the outside, someone who's a disinterested third party, someone who has perspective on what makes a good name from a trademark standpoint and what makes a bad name, and being able to provide a client with options and being able to build consensus around those options is not an easy task. And so having someone who's an expert in this makes a very difficult task immeasurably easier.
But Anthony, like, how many names do people register in the US every year? Do you have those numbers?
Well, it's about 3,000 trademark applications every day. So
Wow.
math is my strong point. Every day, that's correct. Yeah, 3,000 trademark applications every day. So that's so there's a lot, and this has changed over the years. It used to just be a few hundred a day, and of course, it was less than that at some point. But over the last 20 years, it's really grown tremendously. Globalization has affected this a lot. So the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, for instance, has now many, many more trademark applications from China because of the growth of middle-class businesses and smaller businesses there. And so it's becoming incredibly difficult to develop a trademark. Now, domains are also part of the challenge. And domains have always been tough to get, but now it's tougher than ever. And so with domains, anyone can register any domain. And so that makes it very easy for people to scoop up domains and just squat on them, just to park on them. With trademarks, it's a little bit different. You can't file a trademark application unless you have a bona fide intent to use a trademark in commerce. But with domains, anyone can register anything. So there's really different challenges there.
So tell us a bit about the process of naming. So I know that Navot and you had worked together recently. So how does it work? I have a startup, or Navot has a startup. He comes to you and he says, "Listen, Anthony, I need to come up with a great name for my company."
Yeah, that's a good question. So the trademark process typically works like this. We after we agree on our contract, we come together for a kickoff meeting, and I learn from you all there is to know if I'm naming a company, let's say. I want to know about what you're going to be doing. I want to know what your roadmap is, what your business looks like in 5, 10 plus years. How could your business diversify over time? Who are your audiences? What are you creating? How is it different? And this is really important. How is what you're doing different from what any other company is doing? And so after I've reviewed background documents and we've had a conversation, I will send back to you a few days later carefully worded name objectives. These are succinct bullet points that articulate what I need to know and my team insofar as what ideas should the name support or connote, what are different kinds of parameters around the name, what should we be clear to avoid or to focus on. And once the objectives are approved, then we begin creative development. Now, creative development happens in 2 waves. And the first wave is a mile wide and an inch deep. And the second wave is an inch wide and a mile deep. And so I'll explain that. In the first wave of creative development, my team and I are heads down for 2 weeks, and we're developing typically in excess of 1,000 names in that single round, which seems absurd. It seems crazy. But you really need quantity to get to quality, okay? So after 2 weeks of heads down time and trying many different techniques, many different approaches, I employ, on different projects, I may employ AI. I use GPT-2 and GPT-3 as an adjunct to my creative brain and other resources. I also have expertise in computational linguistics, and so I use software and something called corpus linguistics, where I'm diving into databases of 35 billion words that have all been indexed. And I'm using these very powerful tools in addition to that powerful tool between my ears in order to develop interesting names. So at the end of that first 2 weeks, I will amass a list of 100 to 150 names and then put that through trademark screening. I have a trademark partner who does due diligence, and if 150 names come in, perhaps 50 will come back clear from screening. I will present that first round of 50 names to the client. I'm never going to taunt you with names that you obviously can't have, because that's counterproductive. So I want to try to present names that are more likely to be available from a trademark standpoint. You, the client, would react to names. There's names you like, there's names you don't like, there's names you're neutral about. And that is really my input for the second round of work, that inch wide and mile deep. So I'm focusing on the kinds of names that are going to be good for you. So 2 more weeks of heads down time creating, a week for screening. I come back and present typically another 50 names. And so the client will take a look at the 100 names that have been presented to date. Then they will go ahead and I will facilitate selection of a small handful of names, maybe 3 to 5 names that they give to their legal counsel, who does a very thorough screening on those names. Sometimes names will fall out at that stage, which is why I recommend a handful of names, a critical mass of names, and then ultimately from what clears the client, will pick one final name to go to market.
Anthony, in the process, you always said, or at least you told me, never look for a domain for that name, right?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. Well, you want to be very careful about investigating domains, because if you visit a live website and you eventually might want to purchase a domain from that person, you've tipped them off that there is interest in that domain. Especially if it's a domain that doesn't get a lot of hits, then all of a sudden they might see that there's several hits that are coming in from IP addresses, say from Israel, right? Or maybe they have even more information that they can do investigation on the IP addresses that's visited them, and they can see it's owned by a company, right? Maybe you're a resident at a venture capital company, and maybe that could be revealed by your IP address. And so you want to be very careful about revealing to any third party that you want to buy their domain. You don't want to tip off who you are, the fact that you're funded, where you're located, or anything like that. It's always better to avoid going to the website specifically. Instead, you want to start looking at who is information. If you do need to visit the website to see if it's live, you want to use a VPN. So that it doesn't look like that you're coming from any place that might be well-moneyed, and you don't want to tip off that there's a great deal of interest. So you want to go there as little as possible, lest you reveal that you have a strong interest. And eventually, of course, you will contact the third party or have a domain broker do that, which is really what I typically advise, to have a domain broker.
Why domain broker? Why do it through a domain broker?
Because they have expertise in investigating domains and not tipping off people until necessary. And they have expertise in negotiations. So a lawyer could also do this. They're often good at negotiations, but I would just rely on an expert who's really good at that. Now, if you happen to be very good at negotiations, then I suppose there's no harm in having at that yourself. Domain brokers are typically paid on a differential between what their asking price is and what the actual price is that it's sold at. And if they get the domain for less than the asking price, then they split that difference with you, is often how it works, so that it's a win-win for everyone.
So you actually want to save your clients money, so you recommend to them, don't go to these domains, so the domain owners will not, give you a really bad suggestion for whatever you are.
Yeah, that's
to
exactly right. Once they know who you are, it gets expensive. And a good example of this is from a trademark standpoint. This was a little different. It wasn't domain, it was trademark. But as you know, the Facebook parent company renamed themselves Meta. And there was one sticking point from a trademark standpoint, which was a Meta in financial services here in the United States. And Facebook, now Meta, ended up paying $60 million for the rights to the trademark in financial services here in the United States. So, clearly that kind of money was in the offing, especially because the company knew who they were negotiating with, and of course had every right to demand as much money as possible because it was worth a lot to Mark Zuckerberg and company.
So the first time I heard about your kind of profession was on another podcast. There's a podcast that I recommend called Startup. And one of the episodes, and they're like describing all of the process of building the startup, was a name. And they went to, I presume, one of your colleagues that has that I think named Pentium for Intel, like the Pentium. And that was, for me, that was mind-blowing that there's a profession like yours. So can you give us like a few, good names from the industry that you say, this is an amazing name?
Sure. I used to work at that company who named Pentium, so I'm familiar with them. Their name is Lexicon. They named some famous brands, and I worked there in my career. So some good names that I like. I'll just tell you some names that I like off the cuff. There's a baby crib that's named Snoo, Snoo, and that's a name that I like quite a lot. I like the name Snoo. It's a playful name. It sounds a little like snooze, but it's not exactly that. So I like that name a lot. Some other names that I like, I think Fitbit is an excellent name. I
Did you
like that
name
it's.
it?
I did not name Fitbit. However, I have named a number of Fitbit products, such as the Fitbit Sense, the Blaze, the Surge, the Ionic. I've named their headset Fitbit Flyer. So I've named products for Fitbit, but I did not name Fitbit itself. I think that's a great name as well. And one of the
Anthony,
tricks is, yes, go ahead.
I want to talk to you a little bit about name that you think that are bad but are not really bad. For example, when a company called themselves Slack.
Yes, that's a
Do you
great
have
point. Yeah, Slack is a great example, and I'm so happy for Slack that they exist because it demonstrates some of the counterintuitive phenomena that happen in naming. For instance, Slack literally means to not do work. It indicates a lack of productivity, and yet we have Slack, which is used for productivity software. And the crazy part is that no one ever thinks this name is terrible. No one ever goes, wow, this is really bad. You just accept the name. You take it at face value, and it doesn't really enter into the equation as you work with the platform how off base this name really is. Now, what this reveals is that the human mind does not look at names the same way that they look at the words themselves as they're used in other contexts, right? For instance, there's a clothing store called The Gap, right? And The Gap literally means something is missing. And yet, if you ever go to The Gap and they don't have your size, I guarantee none of you have ever thought, no wonder they call this place The Gap. It never enters into your mind. Now, I've come to learn that there's a functional MRI analysis has been done, looking at the human brain as they hear brand names versus other kinds of words, just regular words. And a name that's used as a trademark, even if it's a real word, is processed differently than regular words that we have in our vocabulary to describe something. So if you're using a gap to describe the space between a platform and a train, your brain perceives the word differently in a different part of the brain than if you're talking about the gap where you're going to go pick up a pair of jeans. And so the fact that the human brain processes trademarks, brand names, differently than it does regular words in their usual context helps to account for or explain why a word like Slack or a name like Yelp, an animal in pain, yelps. That's how we know Yelp. It literally means that. You can have a review site called Yelp and never think twice. Oh, is this about animals that are injured? Maybe it's just a site for bad reviews. Never crosses your mind. And the reason is that we perceive trademarks, brand names differently. And that, of course, is a challenge for someone like me when I present names to a client, because the client wants to pressure test names. They want to make sure that there's no problems with the names, or maybe that it can't be negatively perceived. And yet, I know that a name that may have a negative denotation or connotation indeed will be positively perceived once it's launched, right? We all know companies choose names for some positive reason. And so the human brain will adapt and will think, gosh, I wonder why they chose this name. It must have been done for some underlying positive reason. You know, we have convenience stores here in the United States where they sell a brand of potato chips called dirty potato chips. Okay, dirty potato chips. And that's really off-putting, you would think. And yet there it is. And yet you don't look at it and go, that's disgusting. They must be covered with dirt. No, you lean in and you read on the package that they don't wash off the natural potato juices before they fry them. And so they call them dirty potato chips. And it's like, oh, wow. Turns out dirty is actually a reason for being. It's why these are different from, Lay's potato chips. And so it's a very interesting phenomenon as to these so-called negative names end up being potentially very powerful assets for a company.
What about bad names? Do you have can tell us this is a really bad name?
Yeah, sure. I'm not a fan of the name Microsoft. Okay. I think it's a lame, I gotta tell you, it's not a great name. It's pretty descriptive. It's potentially limiting, but you give it allowance. Like Microsoft makes hardware, right? Even though you have software implicit in the name. Micro is small, right? That's not necessarily a good thing either. And so on the face of it, I'm not crazy about the name Microsoft. And yet, just like a name like Yelp or The Gap or Slack, we don't necessarily look at it negatively. And we give it allowance. Like you may recall that the Apple software iTunes, when it was still software, I think it's been retired for other apps now, but you could rent movies on iTunes. And at no point did you think, wait a minute, that name makes no sense, because we give allowance to names. So Microsoft is not a name that I'm crazy about. And of course, the name is not everything. A great company will succeed despite having a middling name. And I think Microsoft is an example like that. Now, a real example of a terrible name was about 15 years ago. The sneaker company, the tennis shoe company Reebok, launched a tennis shoe, a running shoe for women, which they called Incubus. Okay. Now that is a terrible name, full stop, because an incubus is a demon that attacks women in their sleep. Okay. And it is really not what you want to be naming a women's running shoe, unless there was something like, oh, well, you could run away from these demons, these rapey demons, if you have the sneaker on. I have no idea what they were thinking, but I don't think they were thinking, because it is just a terrible name, full stop. So they launched it, and shortly thereafter, after launching it, they learned oh, wow, this is a really bad name, and they had to rescind the product. They had to kill the name, and I don't know what became of it, but it is the best example I have of a really terrible name, and how it ended up being created and vetted by a company and their lawyers that no one knew that this was a demon who attacked women in their sleep. I have no idea, but really a terrific mistake in naming history.
What about cultural differences or language differences? In Israel, we have this a car brand called Kia, which in Hebrew is like a puke, or I once heard of a startup called Zubi, which is male genitalia in Hebrew. So how are you looking at this kind of translation?
And doesn't meta mean death in Hebrew?
Yeah, a lady died.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So this is something that happens because any word in one language is coincidentally likely to be similar or perhaps even exactly the same as an inappropriate word in another language, right? And these things happen, and companies have to make choices when they come up with a name, right? So they may make a strategic decision and say, you know what, this name works in all of these languages except one language. They may decide, you know what, this audience who speaks this language is not large enough given the benefit that the name affords us across these different languages. And so they may say, look, Hebrew speakers, I'm really sorry. We're going to go to market with this name. It's no offense, but the truth is that this name works great for us across all these languages. And I'm afraid in Hebrew, it doesn't work out. And at the end of the day, maybe it ends up being okay in Hebrew. At the end of the day, maybe meta in Hebrew ends up being a little, like Yelp. You just sort of, you shrug it off. It's just a name. They're not really saying that that a woman has died. It's the name of a company, and you begin to perceive that word differently. I don't speak Hebrew, so I can't really tell how that word or a name like Kia works in actual practice in Hebrew. But I would think that you sort of laugh, you giggle, and then you shrug it off is what I would kind of anticipate. What's your experience?
You do know some Yiddish, right?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I come from the Upper West Side of Manhattan, what my mom called a shtetl. And she would, because it was a very Jewish area. It may still be this day, but it was a very Jewish area. And I grew up suckling at the teat of Zabar's. And I don't know if you know who Zabar's is, a famous deli in New York. So
I know.
I know a little Yiddish, Mishigas and Oive and Geshmirin. So
do you ever use it in naming? Will you ever use it?
There's a few Yiddish words that I've put on lists before. So no takers yet. But there's a few Yiddish words. They come across as being very expressive. And I like them. But no takers yet for clients who want to adopt a Yiddish name.
So we are reaching to the end of the podcast. Like, if a startup or a big company, because you also work with corporates, they decide that they want to work with you, what they should do and what mindset they should come to the process? Because I think that a lot of the time people think that they get like the full branding, right?
Well, the first is that any naming project needs support from the company from the top down. You must have this senior management, the C-suite, directly involved in the process. You can't really have proxies at naming meetings because naming is subjective. And it's impossible to predict how someone is individually going to react to a name. So you need to have, for a corporate naming project, the CEO, other C-suite must be directly involved. You also don't want a large team. You want the team to be as small as possible and have all the decision makers in the room, because the quality of your final name is inversely proportionate to the size of the team. So you want a small team. You need to have budget. Typically you need to be a funded startup if you're a startup or an established company. You also need to allow for time. Projects that I'm working on will typically last 6 weeks and end up running into 8 weeks total once you account for client legal screening time. And you need to remind the client to always have an open mind, because you're not going to know the name when you see it. Names do not jump off a page. We think they will because we experience names as actual brands. And once you see a brand with the logo, with the package, with the product, yes, the name will jump off the page then. But when I'm presenting names, it's just a word on a page. Even if I show it mock up on a web page or in software, it's still a word on a page. So you wouldn't expect you're going to know it when you see it. You shouldn't expect that. It's not going to jump off the page. And there is no one right name. There are a million ways to get to the destination. So you shouldn't expect that there's going to be one right name either. And you should be open that any group of names, if you submit 5 names into legal, you don't know what's going to clear. So you shouldn't fall in love with only one name. You need to be good with the whole group of names because you don't know which one is going to survive, and you don't want to feel like you got, your choice of, the bottom of the list.
And I can give you one more tip that Anthony gave me is your opinion change. You think you like a name and then you look at it a day after it and your opinion change and you like another name, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Once you sit with the name, it feels different. And that's because of familiarity. There's something called the Zajunk principle, which is basically things that you're familiar with, you're comfortable with, right? So when I show names, they're different. That's my mandate. Right? And that's necessary because I'm developing a trademark for you. So by definition, it's going to be unique. Even if it's a real word, it's going to be unique in the context. And so you see the word initially, it's unfamiliar to you, so it's uncomfortable for you. It's perhaps good for the survival of the human race generally, but this is an instinct we have to fight against in developing and adopting a brand name. And so you see it initially, maybe you're uncomfortable with it, but then you sleep on it a couple days and then it becomes more familiar and comfortable for you. And the names you may have liked immediately, if there are any, they become less interesting to you. They're not as memorable or they're boring. They start feeling boring to you. So you're absolutely right. The way the name sits in you over a couple days is an important part of the process. So you get a better idea about those names that have staying power.
Okay, Anthony, we are on time.
One question before we leave. What's your biggest achievement? Which name are you most proud of?
Oh, that's tough. Because there's different aspects I have of pride, I guess. I'm very proud of directing the Accenture naming project, the renaming of Andersen Consulting to Accenture, which I directed back in 2000. And I didn't create the name Accenture, but I did choose it off a list of names created by Accenture employees. So I'm very proud of the success of that company, which has grown from 65,000 people in 2000 to over 300,000 people today. So I'm quite proud of that name. I also created the name Yum Brands when that spun off of PepsiCo. I'm quite proud of that. And there's other names I'm proud of. These names I've done for companies like Fitbit, naming Qualcomm Snapdragon, which has done great things for Qualcomm. These are all names that I'm proud of to this day.
I think that for me, it's Adobe Lightroom, the name that
thank you so much. I love the name Adobe Lightroom. It's done great things for the company. It's an important product. And, it's a name I developed. And also on my team, 2 or 3 other namers on my team at the time also came up with Lightroom. So we all kind of came up with Lightroom, and eventually, I presented the name and it became the name, and it's done great things for Adobe. So I'm quite proud of that name too. Thank you.
But sometimes the name think alike.
Aviv, the name he likes the most is the name that he came up for me. That
yes,
we will reveal soon. We will reveal it sooner.
All right, okay. Amazing. Anthony Shore, thank you so much. ועד כאן, 30 דקות או פחות, פרק יוצא דופן שאני סופר נהנתי ממנו. נגיד תודה לנותנת החסות שלנו אינטל איגנייט, תוכנית האצה בת 12 שבועות שמפגישה יזמים עם מנטורים בכירים מאינטל ומהתעשייה. כל סטארט-אפ שמתקבל מלווה במנטור אישי שהוא יזם סדרתי מהתעשייה ובמומחה טכנולוגי מאינטל שדואג למקסם את הערך שהסטארט-אפ יכול לקבל מהחיבור לאינטל. אז איגנייט בוחרת לתוכנית של הסטארט-אפים עם פוטנציאל להביא לשינויים דרמטיים בתחום שלהם ושיש להם את היכולת להוביל חדשנות בשוק גלובלי. אז אם אתם כאלה, סטארט-אפ שגייס לאחרונה לפחות $1,000,000 ועוסקים בטכנולוגיות עמוקות בתחומים כמו בינה מלאכותית, מערכות אוטונומיות, מערכות מחשוב וסייבר, ייכנסו לאתר ותגישו מועמדות www.intel.com/ignite www.intel.com/ignite.
הפרק הזה זמין בספוטיפיי, בכלכליסט, בכל מקום שאתם מאזינים לפודקאסטים. אהבתם, אז תאזינו גם לרן פיין, שהוא גם כן כותב, ויש לו הרבה דברים על שפה. יאללה, אנתוני, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for having me.